The Gospel according to Mark, the 8th chapter. Then Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." The Gospel of the Lord. You may be seated. Have you ever walked into a room where it was clear that there was a rather intense conversation already going on, and it was pretty well developed already before you got there, and you didn't know quite what everybody was talking about, but there were glimpses of it? And in the midst of that, you weren't quite sure what you should agree with and what you shouldn't agree with. One could even imagine that in the midst of walking into such a situation, maybe the room fell silent, that your showing up interrupted things in a way that shut down the conversation, and that silence became awkward. The other night at the evangelism committee meeting, as we read Paul's letter to the Romans, well, I have to tell you, it felt just a little bit like that. Well, except the room didn't fall silent. Paul kept making his point, and careful hearers of that, perhaps interlopers into that conversation, well, they had to ask the question, what's going on here? Part of what's going on is during this Lenten season, the lectionary does some interesting things. We hear gospel readings that talk about Jesus in his journey along the path and his ministry, but it's leading him to Jerusalem. And as he gets to Jerusalem, we hear him framing out what's going to happen, and it's not exactly what we would like to see coming to pass. And in the first readings, we're hearing covenant. We're hearing about the various covenants that God has enacted with God's people. Last week it was Noah and that covenant after the flood. This week is the covenant with Abraham and the promise that he will have children and a family that is as numerous as the stars in the sky. The next couple of weeks we will hear covenant with Moses and the people. The second readings, this Romans reading, the second readings during Lent offer us a glimpse of what life in the early church looks like. Remembering that the early Jesus movement did not have the New Testament and all of the Gospels and any of those other writings. For them, the scriptures were the Hebrew scriptures. They had those scriptures that had been handed down to them from generation to generation, and they had the promises that had been offered to them from generation to generation, century after century. What we hear is the early church interpreting those promises from God to a Hebrew people in light of Jesus Christ. Today, the church hears Paul writing to that congregation in Rome. And you may remember that that church in Rome was a church that had a whole lot of good Jewish people in it, but they also had a whole group of faithful Gentiles or Greeks. Paul is offering that community some sense of how to live with their mixed heritage as they live together faithfully. In many ways, what Paul offers that people is also something that could be important and helpful to us as a nation, as we deal with the fact that there are so many different opinions and different ways of seeing how being faithful looks. But nonetheless, what the church hears is kind of like walking into a room where a debate, or at least an intense conversation, has already been going on for quite a while. And to step into that text, well, it's just a little bit disorienting. So here's how the conversation began. It's important to remember that Paul's theme sentence for that letter to the Romans, clear back in the first chapter, goes something like this. This is where he frames everything that he is going to build his part of the conversation around. He says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For in it, the righteousness of God is revealed through faith. As it is written, the one who is righteous will live by faith." It is also important to remember that righteousness in Jewish understanding and in Jewish thought is more about right relationship. Relationship first with God and with all others. It's important to remember that relationship, that righteousness is first an act and action of God. And as Paul points out, the righteousness of God is revealed through the gospel. Even if that wonderful statement where Paul goes on a couple of chapters later, and oh, we Lutherans love it, even that is a challenge to us to see more deeply into ways that God's righteousness is revealed. You know this. Paul writes, "Since all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, they are now justified by grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus." The law does not save. Doing things right does not save. There is nothing any of us can do to save ourselves, Paul is telling us. Rather, we all fall short of the glory of God. And here is where we pick things up today in our reading. You see, for Paul, that means that neither Jew nor Gentile has room to boast. No one can help themselves. Salvation is a free gift from God. And to illustrate his point, he lifts up Abraham, who trusted God's promise. Now, you may recall that Abraham had moments where he didn't do so well trusting God's promise, where he and Sarah decided that they'd take things into their own hands to help God fulfill God's promises. But that's not the point today. In the end, it is God who is faithful, not us. It is God who comes to make everything come to pass in the promises. Like Abraham, we hope against hope for the blessed promises to come true. And grounded in those promises, the faithful live out love for God and for our neighbors. The faithful take up the cause of those who are in need, those who are on the margin, and those who struggle in mind, body, and spirit. In Jesus, though, the faithful have the embodied promise that death and failure don't get the final word. Rather, Jesus, who died on account of human sinfulness, was also raised precisely for our justification. Paul uses this promise, God's covenantal promise, and Abraham's life as an example of what living together faithfully will look like. For the church in Rome, that meant that they may have significant differences of opinion and practice, and yet for those same faithful people, Paul reminds them to focus on the power of the gospel, the power of God to work righteousness for you and for me. The promise is that through Christ, we have already been blessed. And like Abraham, the blessing is not just for us and for our sake. The blessing we have received is for the sake of the world, for the sake of all people, for the sake of all nations. Hoping against hope in the promise that God has made us righteous through Jesus' death and resurrection, the faithful are blessed to be a blessing.